Hey, welcome to a look at Chapter 5 of the Young Bucks book, Killing the Business from Backyards to the Big Leagues. I decided to do it outside today. It should be fun. Here at the pool, and my kid, who you'll see swimming in the background once in a while. It's really chilly, but it is Florida, so it's still sunny and awesome and stuff. And she just dived right in. And I think that's an appropriate metaphor for the Young Bucks, certainly. Because now, as we get into superhero origin story, which is done by the oldest brother, Matt, we really get the sense of the Bucks' career taking off. And superhero origin story is a great title and very fitting. I enjoyed this chapter quite a bit. I think this is what most people have bought this book for, is you're really getting into their wrestling career. I think everything up to now, though, has been absolutely stellar. So the writing of this book is one of the biggest surprises. I thought it would be okay, but it's much more than okay. I would say there are times where it approaches greatness. And this chapter just hits you with one great thing after another. And let's dive in. So February 16th, 2005, I love details. Really put me in a sense of time of where they were compared to where I was, that kind of thing. So Full Contact Wrestling, FCW, is a lucha-based company. So Matt's 19 and in his second year of wrestling, and Joey Chaos, I guess, saw him at Hybrid Pro Wrestling Show in Culver City. I believe I actually saw that show at one point, meaning Hybrid Pro. So they're gonna get $75 to do a tag match, he and his brother, and they were looking for where they're placed on the card, and they noticed that Slick Nick and Mr. Instant Replay weren't listed there. It just said Matt and Nick, the Young Bucks, and they hated the Young Bucks name, but they decided to roll with it. I think the Young Bucks show a really good lesson here, which is they just kind of roll with something, and then later on, when people want to call them Matt and Nick Jackson, because they wrestled for like an NWA show, and they're like, "Oh, we don't like you, Mister. We don't have room to put all that junk. We're just gonna put Matt and Nick Jackson." They hated that too, but as more and more people started booking them that way, they just went with it. And I think there's a great lesson there in the balance between doing what you want to do, and what you think you want to do, and doing something that fans seem to take towards. Really, really great. So Nick, keep in mind when they're doing all this stuff, is 15. But luckily, they both of them worked out and were dedicated to that, so they didn't quite look their age, so they got by with it. But I think that's just hysterical that Nick's 15 and wrestling on these things. Really great. I don't want to just point out every little thing I loved about the chapter, because I really advise you to get this book on your own. It's more about looking at it from sort of a literary standpoint and things that really jumped out at me. I like how Matt in particular, when he writes, takes us into his mindset about things. So, not to mention, they were already spooked about what happened to LTP. So somebody got hurt in the very first match, landed on his head, and had to be taken out on a stretcher. So Matt's thoughts were going to his parents as well. Like, they're going to watch us. They're already spooked about this dude getting hurt. This match is going to be in a style that they don't like because it's full contact wrestling. So the mat, they tended to work stiffer, so they knew their parents would be like, yeesh. So they did a great job, I guess, long story short. And the next day they were booked at a small independent show, which had like 30 fans, after wrestling in front of 7,000, like rabid fans. So I just love this line. It was my first indication of the highs and lows that come with this business. It wouldn't be my last. If that ain't the truth, anybody who's involved in wrestling definitely did a with that one. So now people are, wanting to book them together as the Young Bucks. So they got some gear made, sort of. They're really poor. And I think this juxtaposition of when you first make it, or start making headway in wrestling, but you're still broke. So I just loved, I mean, if you want to sit here and say you hate the Young Bucks for any number of reasons, I would just challenge you to read this book and say the same. You really get the sense of how hard they worked and the intelligence that they showed. So Matt talks. One night, I put the Arnold Schwarzenegger bodybuilding documentary Pumping Iron and was inspired by the poses the bodybuilders did during the competitions. Some were absolutely silly, sure, and sometimes the bodybuilders flashed the tackiest smiles, but the performative aspect interested me. We had a tag name, we had the matching gear. Now all we needed was some type of pose we could do. Right then and there, I came up with the idea for us to do the double bicep leaned over pose, which these days is commonly referred to as the Young Bucks pose. While backstage at the next FCW show, we took pictures doing that very pose, and we've never stopped since. Then Matt goes into his relationship with Dana and how she kind of gives him an ultimatum, how he broke off dates with her to do wrestling gigs, how her parents didn't really care for him because it looked like he was going nowhere with this stuff. And of course, this part just hit me so hard, right? I've dedicated myself to wrestling in a different way as well, and never had the sort of career that my ex-wife probably would have wanted me to have, and it's always been sort of hand to mouth. I'm still waiting to make it in wrestling, but at the same time, I'm going to continue to push, continue to do show reviews, continue to sort of help people in the business, continue to think about wrestling, talk about wrestling, study wrestling. Definitely doing my thing. But the hustle that they put for HRW, their backyard league, which now became an independent league, all the ways that they got sponsors, things they pitched to businesses, it was really, really great. And then they started training, doing basics for people at $10 a head to make a little extra scratch. And they had everybody sign a waiver. Our parents had taught us well, avoid trouble at all costs. I, too, was a sign the waiver guy, for sure. Then they went to WrestleMania 21, which was at the Staples Center. And Hulk Hogan came out unexpectedly. And, of course, that was their favorite wrestler from back in the day. And I thought it was just really cool. And the Shawn Michaels versus Angle match, which was, like, their favorite match that they'd ever seen live, as far as, like, the style of match and how hitting and fast moving it was. I left the arena inspired and hungry. Man, people go like, how can I watch so much wrestling? How can I do things like read this Young Bucks book and one chapter at a time do a review? How can I still be involved in wrestling after everything? It's because every show that I watch, even the bad ones, leave me inspired and hungry. And so that really resonated with me as well. I really love this chapter. It's probably pretty obvious. And then he talked about the relationship he and Chris Kanyon had as friends, and how Kanyon came down and did their Halloween show. And they had 300 people in this holiday skating center, which was their biggest crowd to date. So they saw the power in having somebody who's got a name. He talks about Kanyon coming out to him over the phone and how understanding he was of that, and how Kanyon, who is bipolar, had these manic episodes, but then he also had these depressed. You see my kid in the background over there doing her thing. How he would have these depressed episodes, and how he had to once talk him down from killing himself, but then Kanyon years later would. And then he ends one part of this right here with, he was the first wrestler whom I was close to that had died. It's just, again, this book, I mean, it's funny, it's smart, it's honest, it's heartbreaking. It's really good. Also around this time, we'd bump into Scorpio Sky every weekend at a different Southern California independent show. Now, keep in mind, Scorpio Sky was the first guy who was nice to them when they started training, like legitimate pro wrestling training, right? Um, I keep telling Scorpio Sky says, I keep telling Super Dragon to book you guys at PWG. You guys are ready, but he won't listen to me. And Matt reminds us, Super Dragon didn't like me because of the way I acted all those years ago during that class he guest trained, and I guess Nick caught some of that heat by association. They knew they needed to make it at PWG because if they had plans on expanding out of California, they had to make it there first. And I think this is really apropos, especially to the wrestlers of Georgia. You really need to conquer the places where you are. There's always this thing about, like, you need to wrestle elsewhere, and that's definitely true. But if you can't be the top person in your backyard, the chances of you really learning on what it takes to be big elsewhere are much reduced, or your learning curve is going to be smaller. You want to definitely learn to do your thing. And they recognized they had a series of goals, and their goal was, we want to get booked at Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and we want to make it there because then we feel like we could be ready to do things elsewhere. But they also wrestled for an NWA promotion in California who filmed local television, so they learned how to wrestle TV style. I just love how they're sort of keeping us up with their evolution and the things that they're learning. And now they've got like better gear. And then a producer came up to them at the NWA taping. They're like, you need more TV-friendly names. Mr. Instant Replay and Slick Nick, the Young Bucks, doesn't roll off the tongue. You guys will now be Matt and Nick Jackson, the Young Bucks. They hated it, but then they rolled with it because everybody else seemed to take to it, too, that they were wrestling at. Smart. And so Matt ends talking about he and Dana and how they had kept in contact. And at her 21st birthday party in Vegas, she was like, come save me. So he packed up his car and went and saved her. And then a few months later, he proposed. And Matt's, I guess, the shyer one. So he did I just think it's awesome. He ends the chapter talking about the ring. She said yes, and I slid a ring that I couldn't afford under my future wife's finger. I had put all the money I had to my name down on that ring and financed the rest. The company who sold me the ring would eventually stop getting payments from me and would sell the debt to a debt collector agency. I would ignore their phone calls for years. I didn't care about the cost of the ring. I was overjoyed that I was finally going to marry the woman whom I had been with since the very beginning, the only woman I'd ever loved. So it was a very smart, again, show don't tell is a sign of good literature. And they're showing us, without saying we still struggled for years, he uses this sort of story about the engagement ring to let us know it'd been years, we were still not making huge money. I also like that Matt dropped a little note in here about, at one point, wrestling Chuck Palumbo as sort of like a jobber guy on SmackDown, and a fan that had sort of kept in touch with them that whole time. Because it segues nicely into the next chapter, which is called Extra Talent by Nick. And I can't wait to read it. But this has been a look at Chapter 5 by Matt, called Superhero Origin Story. It definitely has gotten this book going in a big way. I feel like now, just like I felt like I know Nick really well after the last chapter, I feel like I know Matt really well on this chapter. And now that I feel like I know both of these guys, now we're really diving into their pro wrestling career. It's a very smart way to do the book. I'm very excited about the rest of the book. In fact, it's hard to not just leap ahead, but I want to stick with this thing of doing a chapter a day because I think the book really warrants it. And I think it's a better way to sort of publicize the book for them anyway, such as it is. Anyway, I encourage you to get the book. I'm having a great time. A couple of people have now said have contacted me, said they've gotten the book, and now they're kind of keeping pace with me every day. So just know I ain't going to give up on it. If anything, I'm going to race ahead. But just stick with this chapter a day with me, and we'll all have a good time because this book is pretty great. Anyway, thanks a lot, and I'll see you tomorrow.